Good morning, guys. How are you? Yeah, I'm really honored just to be able to share some testimonies of what the Lord has been doing in Mozambique and South Africa. And before I get into that, I felt it would just be helpful just to briefly share my background because some of you may not know me. I grew up on the East Coast. I did not grow up in a Christian home. And I actually met the Lord while I was doing my PhD at MIT in math, of all places to meet God. But it was like a light switch turned on, and I had a desire to read the Bible. And I started reading one of the Gospels and just got completely undone by Jesus. And instantaneously, like, he made me into a new woman. I used to have really bad anxiety attacks. They were gone. I had an explosive temper. It was gone. And for the first time in my life, I had peace. And interestingly, when I met the Lord, I was in a same-sex relationship and then a same-sex marriage. So the Lord did a whole work of healing my identity as a woman and bringing me out of that lifestyle. But I share that just to encourage you because I know so many of us that we've either struggled or someone that we know and love is struggling either with their gender or their sexuality. So if God did it for me, I know he can do it for you too, or for that person. And then... Yeah, Jesus is amazing. So after I finished at MIT, I worked for 8 years as a software engineer at Google, and I had a lot of fun with the Lord doing marketplace ministry, and the Lord gave me he always gave me favor with my bosses, and I was able to minister with people from all walks of life, whether it be the cleaning staff, the kitchen staff, all the way up to Google executives. And the Lord, as soon as I laid down that relationship with my ex, the Lord began to open doors for me to travel internationally. He brought me to something like 19 different countries. And I extensively traveled with 2 itinerant ministers. One's named Ken Fish and the other's Robbie Dawkins. Ken moves very powerfully in deliverance and inner healing and healing. He's an amazing teacher, very strong revelatory gifting. And Robbie is a power evangelist and really an equipper. He equips people to do the stuff that Jesus did. And so all that was super foundational for the missions work that I'm now doing in Mozambique and South Africa. So fast forward a bit, 2019. It's a long story. I wish I could share it with you. But God tells me to quit my job, sell everything. He opens a door for me to serve with Heidi Baker in northern Mozambique in Pemba. And I'll share a little bit about Iris real quick. So Iris, our mission, we're compelled by the love of God to stop for the one in need through worship, outreach, family, education, relief, development, healing, and the arts. And Heidi and Roland Baker, they came to Mozambique in 95, shortly after Mozambique had come out of civil war. It was a very desperate situation. At the time, Mozambique was the poorest country on the planet. And tons of kids had been orphaned from the war, and they began working with these street kids. Many of them were heavily demonized, and they began to see revival among these street kids just as they encountered the love of Jesus. Many of them would get caught up into heaven. They were shown visions of heaven and hell. They would regularly see miracles break out. They would see food multiply, blind eyes and deaf ears open. They've planted over 10,000 churches in the country and raised up tons of local pastors. They started primary and secondary schools, medical clinics. We're starting a university in the north. We're believing to open this year. Pray for that to happen. And another thing, not more recently, but because it's been going on for a while, but the province that we're in Cabo Delgado in the north, has been in a war. And there's radical jihadists that have been burning down villages. They've been beheading people. They're persecuting Christians. Over 1 million people have been displaced from their homes, and thousands have lost their lives, many people whom we know and love. And as far as my work with Iris, I do a bunch of different things. So I'm helping to get the university open. I'm part of Heidi's executive admin team. I preach, I teach, I travel and minister, and I'm also an intercessor. So these are just some of the places where God's brought me in Mozambique, but most of my time I stay in Pemba. That's home for me there. So this lady, Her name is Mama Fatima, the lady on the right. And she is from a place called Mozambique de Praia, and she's a Christian. She used to be a Muslim, and she had planted a church in Mozambique de Praia, and that's her with one of her daughters. And she is one of these people that had to flee from her home because of the terrorism. The terrorist group, they're locally known as Al-Shabaab, but they're being backed by ISIS. And they came into the town pretending to be Mozambican soldiers, and they deceived the people. They were in that town for a couple weeks, and then one night they heard a lot of heavy firing. And at first they thought it was just the military doing drills, but eventually her son spoke up and said, something's not right here. I think this is Al-Shabaab. And she ends up with her children and ending up having to flee her home. She said she grabbed her Bible because she couldn't bear to leave it behind. And one of her daughters was 7 months pregnant at the time. As they were fleeing, she could actually hear them looking for her. They said, bring out the Christian woman, the one who used to be a Muslim and who started a church here, because everyone knew she was a very strong Christian. And miraculously, they escaped. They were in the bush for several days without food or water. Sadly, the daughter that was 7 months pregnant ended up dying, and she lost her baby as well. But yeah, I know. But the rest of her family made it to Pemba, and we were able to build them a house. You can see she's still carrying the joy of the Lord despite what she's been through. And I went to visit her one day, and she was deaf in her right ear, and the Lord opened up her right ear. And this just to show you the living conditions that these internally displaced people are in. It's literally a very desperate situation, just tarp and cardboard siding. It's either like that, or many of them will come to stay with a relative, and you can have up to 20 people in a single room. It's very, just huge need. But in the midst of that, there's tremendous hunger for Jesus. So you can see here on the beach there in Pemba, it's hundreds of these dislocated people that are lining up to be baptized. We're just seeing multitudes come into the kingdom right now. And this is a picture of me baptizing a little girl in the Indian Ocean there in Pemba with one of our local pastors, Carlos. Praise God. And then this was one of our outreaches in a place called Miezi, and that lady in the middle, she was deaf in both ears, and God opened up her ears. Yeah. And on the same outreach, Heidi had a word of knowledge that there would be a deaf and a mute person healed, and a young man was deaf and mute, and the Lord opened up his ears and his mouth. And the food never ran out. There were so many people, but the food never ran out. So I believe God multiplied the food as well. And then this is an aerial view of the university in Pemba. So we have way more land than this, but this just shows part of it. Some of our classrooms and the auditorium. We also have a house of prayer, various admin offices. We have a sports center off in the distance. You won't be able to see it there. And then we have more land in the back where we've been building student housing and housing for professors as well. I know, and it's desperately needed right now. And then these are some of the places that God's brought me to in South Africa. So this past year, I did 2 ministry trips with a man named Brian Blount. He's actually a vineyard pastor. And then I did 1 solo ministry trip there. But you can see the different cities where God's brought me. And this lady on the right, so we ministered to her in a township outside of Durban. And she had a stroke 3 months prior. And she couldn't walk well at all. She had to use a crutch to walk. And some of the team prayed for her. God heals her. She was able to walk without the crutch. And we found out the following Sunday, she showed up at the church. This lady was a witch doctor, so she renounced being a witch doctor, gives her life to Christ. Yeah, and that's her with one of the local pastors. Come on, Jesus. And then this story is really incredible. This was in a restaurant in Cape Town. And this waitress here, she had broken her arm, and they had put a metal plate in it. And you could feel the metal plate in her arm. And we prayed for her. First, we prayed just for the pain to go, because she still had a tremendous amount of pain. The pain left. Then we said, let's pray for the plate to dissolve. And so we prayed, and God dissolved the metal plate. She could no longer feel it there. Yeah, and we've seen that more than once. Okay. And then this is me with Pastor Lindiwe in King Williamstown. I included this here because this was my first solo international ministry trip, so it was a big leap of faith for me, and praising God for the testimonies. So the word that the Lord gave me ended up being a confirmation for them to start up a ministry that they had laid down, and they've been praying into if they were supposed to start it again. And we also just saw so many healings break out in the services there. And then finally, this was meant to be a video, but just in the interest of time. So 3 of us, we were in the Cape Town International Airport and went to a place called Mug and Bean. It's like a Starbucks, but better. And we just went there to get a coffee. But then I had a word of knowledge for the cashier that she had pain in her back, and the Lord ends up healing her. But then all the staff start coming out wanting prayer, and God starts to give the team words of knowledge for different physical conditions that they had. The healings break out. Many of them gave their lives to Christ. I think it was like 10 people total that got touched by the Lord. But that happens often just as we go about our days there in South Africa because the hunger is just so great. And then finally, these are just some of my prayer requests. Oh, sure. So yeah, you guys can pray for God to open up more nations and doors to minister. I'd love to be able to start taking ministry teams out. Just continuing to mature in the prophetic and intercession for the university to open, pray over the end time harvest, and for financial provision. Thank you, guys.